Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Catherine Shao, and I'm the Vice President of the Sales Enablement Practice here at Oxygen. Oxygen helps companies drive growth by modernizing sales enablement and also workplace education. And interestingly, we've been designing and delivering modern experiential learning programs for years. But I think we'd all agree that in the last several months, we've been presented with all kinds of challenges, literally all at once, around personal interaction. I mean, it's crazy, right? So for today, we've been on the front lines the last few months, helping our customers and partners really make a pivot over to virtual learning. And so we're looking forward to sharing some of that insight and learnings. So today we're going to present how to upshift from in-person to engaging virtual learning experiences with Oxygen CEO Juliana Stancampiano. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have questions during the presentation, just go ahead and type them into the chat window. We will have some time set aside for discussion, a little bit in the middle and a little bit also at the end. So before we get started, we would love to have you all participate in a poll that will help us drive some of our discussion today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that and would love for people to go ahead and cast your vote as to what topics you're most interested in. We're seeing those answers come in. Awesome. Look at that. We'll take a look at.
So just a note on this, we've learned through doing this a lot now on polls to give polls about 15 to 20 seconds before you can kind of shut them down. So we're going to dive into lots of those types of details as we talk through this, because that's kind of where the heart of a lot of learning is for people. Yeah. How do we do this, and how, as we get into these things, what does it actually take?
Yes, and as the omniscient host, I can tell you that 48 seconds have passed. So we're going to go ahead and end that and share the results here. Take a look. Big winner, interactive design. So, and not too far behind virtual experience mapping. So this is great. I think we'll be able to spend a little bit of time on those topics. Cool. All right, Juliana, I'm going to just hand it right over to you, and we will get started.
Terrific. Awesome. Thanks, Catherine. So welcome, everybody. As Catherine said, this is actually our first of a webinar series for Oxygen, and we are looking forward to kicking off and continuing to do this through time. I want to thank Ned and Lisa on the team that are here for getting us all set up and going. And I'm going to just dive right into it. So obviously, everybody's working remotely right now, and some of us are starting to go a little bit back to the office, but it's still a remote environment. And now what? And as I told my team, I wish that my working from home looked like this. What this lady's doing definitely doesn't look quite so great when I'm working from home. And in that space, we're running businesses, we're running groups, we're running teams, we're doing so much. We are on these calls a lot. Webinar attendance has climbed dramatically while we've all been working from home, as people are educating themselves, but also have more time because they're not going places. So, now that we're doing that, now what? And that's really what we need to figure out and what we're going to talk about today. I think, the interesting thing and what we saw, and a lot of this is going to be followed by examples and what we're seeing with the different clients that we work with. But we did a really fast transition from anything that was in person, all of a sudden was just gone. And all of a sudden it became virtual, right? And we had some really interesting discussions that we'll get into about what does virtual live events mean. But right now, the majority of companies that we know have stopped or have all of their in-person experiences, conferences, events, learning, etc., through the rest of the year, as we know, and some through the rest of next year. And so knowing that, we have to be as prepared as we can to be addressing what it is that we need people to know and do at work in a virtual environment, and get the information out to them, get the connection with them, etc. I found it interesting because any of you that were around in 2008 doing this, that's when I started Oxygen, amazing time to start a company. But, everything went very virtual at that point, and the technology was a lot different then, but there's still a lot of those principles, I would say, of a virtual experience that we're able to harness. And so moving into this for us, I was like, great, we've done this before, we've been through this drill, but we had a big ramp on what technology can do now today. The other interesting kind of just tidbit there is that I found it fascinating that a lot of virtual live events had gone away and had been replaced. I don't know if it was just the economic environment that we're in, that travel became that much easier and expected almost, but a lot of our clients weren't doing any virtual live events as we went into the pandemic early this year. So that was interesting to see that shift. And then there were many people in the workplace that hadn't been through the 2008 to about 2000 time frame, and we're learning all over again. So the first thing we're going to talk about is defining virtual. And Catherine, I'm going to let you share kind of the experience that you had with this as we did this fast turn into virtual.
Yeah, so we had a client who kind of came to us with the exact scenario that Juliana was mentioning. Hey, we had these in-person things. We were going to do this 2-day boot camp, you know, all over the globe, different sessions, and all of a sudden that couldn't happen. And they said, we want to switch to virtual. And we actually made a big assumption that when they said virtual, they meant, oh, okay, an instructor-led still, or a facilitator-led type of session that's done live that you invite people to. And come to find out after a fair bit of back and forth that no, what they really meant was a self-service, on-demand, not really mandatory type of thing, which, as you can imagine, that's a huge contrast between two different types of, quote, virtual things. So that's why we have our word virtual in little quotes. It's really, really important to get all the assumptions out on the table of what is meant by virtual.
Yeah, so interesting for us, we made this shift to virtual and we mapped out the experience and then realized this lack of expectation and had to then shift again to this online experience that they were actually looking for. So, you know, an interesting case in point on that is that the people that we were working with were in lines of business. They were not in learning, they weren't in sales enablement, they weren't in an area that may understand the vernacular a little bit more when we talk about what I have tried to take out of my vernacular, which is VILT, because a lot of people we talk to have no idea what that means, or even ILT, but start talking about virtual live experiences or online experiences so that we can hopefully take out some of those assumptions. And people in the business have no idea what you're talking about when you say a VILT or even virtual. They need more specifics, and that's what we learned from that experience. So just not making some of those mistakes that we made early on. I'm sure most of you have been through that at this point, but if you're working with new people, new stakeholders, just be wary of the language that we assume other people know. And then the objectives are the same as they were in person. You know, there's different things that you can get from an in-person event. And we've been running a lot of like boot camp type of things virtually that, you know, you can't go into the different centers and actually experience what a walkthrough of the technology looks like. That's going to be very different, you know. So are we expecting people to get the same thing out of these virtual experiences versus what they have been able to in an in-person experience? So things to think through as you're making those shifts. I think one of my favorite aspects to this, and I'll credit Jason on my team with saying it and then us all having a reaction to it, but time virtually needs to be treated differently than it would in an in-person or an online experience. It is not a lift and shift. And that's become my new favorite phrase. Like there's very little things that are just a lift and shift. So when you think about a virtual event, you have to think about all the things that are going on around people. We're still at home, we're still working, we're still expected to be doing things. Even in onboarding, we found there's an expectation that people are doing other things. And so, you know, your 1 week event or your 2-day event is all of a sudden needing to be spread through time, and it has to have a very different expectation to that. Catherine, do you want to talk about the example that we had that you just worked on?
Yeah, I mean, so originally, when we had mapped out this live event, we were imagining people in breakout groups. We were imagining them practicing, having conversations. This was a large group of sellers across the globe, and we were going to help these people get prepared for customer meetings and have all the color that they needed, which is really great to do when you're live, because you can just kind of chit chat, and the fidelity you get in a live conversation is, it's amazing. But we really had to rethink everything when all of a sudden it was about being online and being, quote, virtual. All of a sudden, the idea of practice becomes something much trickier. And being able to do that over even over a meeting like this for us to practice is kind of hard, because you can see me and you can read my body language, but you might miss some other nuances. Maybe if I wave my arms, I'd go out of the picture. There's a lot of different things to consider. And I think what Juliana's put on the screen here too is that whether you're doing a conference versus maybe a program, and perhaps you could describe the difference. I mean, we think of conferences as events that are like big and broadcasty, but a program might be more focused to a specific audience. So
yeah, and the differences that we're seeing between the conference and events and the programmatic view is exactly to that point. So there's a whole host of different technology for conferences and events, because there's a lot of different considerations around registration and different things and aspects. And there's typically a lot more content. There's tracks, there's so there's different angles that you have to take when thinking about a virtual live conference, versus this programmatic view, where it might be a field manager experience through time, or it might be onboarding, it might be a technical boot camp. Any of those aspects are more programmatic. You're going to have potentially smaller groups, so you can do different things, and you can typically use the technology that you're probably already using in-house, or whatever it's ramped up to since COVID, because I think that's shifting, as we've all seen, the spikes of all of our friends in tech and their stock go up during this time period, as everybody really swings hard with this and trying to figure out how to do it. So thinking through those nuances, those are very different. We've done both, and they require, a different planning process, and all of the aspects are essentially different, from the content, the technology, the outcomes, etc. Networking for a conference, that's still, if anybody has any tips on how a good networking experience that they've had virtually, we'd love to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
So as we continue going through this, the other aspect is the content, right? So while timing's not a lift and shift, content isn't necessarily a one-on-one either. You can't just take content that you were going to do live and put it in a virtual experience. You have to think through what it looks like virtually, and are you mapping content to the most effective modality or platform as you're going through this. And I'm going to hold some of it, because we're going to actually dive into to a lot more details about creating an experience map for content as we go through this. But not everything can be, that you can do in person, can you do virtually, in my mind. And I've heard others think differently. And so I love hearing those points of view as well. I was on a call yesterday where somebody who's a coach kind of blew my mind with what they thought could be done virtually versus where my mindset is, which maybe I need to shift a little bit more of a growth mindset on that. As I said, you're gonna shift some content into this offline or self-service modalities. We see this a lot. If people can read something in advance, watch a quick video in advance of doing something else live, and using that live time to really practice, engage, discuss material, we find that to be very helpful for people. I think, you also get that pushback of, but people aren't doing the online things, and they're not engaging with that. And I would probably say, let's rethink then what's needed and what's of value. I find that if something is going to be of value to the person in their role, probably in that time period, more than likely they're going to consume it and want to come and talk about it, because it's something that they're dealing with in a live situation, potentially in front of a customer. So those are kind of some of those things to think about. You don't want to waste people's time right now either. There's so much to do and think about in the world. So making sure that everything is really relevant and targeted, I think is really important. And then considering just different types of engagement for the content you have. I think, this is a big moment for communities and community managers in building a different type of engagement than what we've been able to do before with the technology that's out there to build communities and do that internally for different groups. We've done a lot of that across onboarding cohorts or specific role cohorts so that they can start to just share information and knowledge like we may have at work in the office in the hallways previously. A lot of that's being driven online. And there's a new book out by Melissa Jones. We could send this out afterwards about building communities that just released the other day. So I'd love to give her a shout out. She's done a lot of community building before anybody knew what a community manager was. She was in on that. So we're going to talk, and so this is great. So the poll in the beginning was fantastic because this is going to depict how much time we spend doing this versus talking about some of the other areas. I think we all know figuring out the right technology and service, what version to use, et cetera, is important and something that we need to be doing. We ran into this and had some really interesting back and forth just within our own team in the beginning, that the technology had shifted so much and the add-ons and the different things that you can incorporate into whatever you use and then how you use it. It took a lot of time and a lot of practice in kind of a fire drill mode in order to figure this out so that we weren't, showing up and just going through lots of slides. Catherine, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the experience you've had with this as well.
Yeah, I mean, we, and actually somebody kind of brought up on the chat too, like Zoom versus Teams versus ... which works better. And I think there's, everybody has different tech in their organization. And we were in a situation where we had Teams in our client's org, and we needed to make a lot of recorded videos, and we just kind of assumed, okay, we'll use Teams. Come to find out that Teams is great. It does a lot of great stuff. The one thing to remember that we learned was when you do a recording, it actually records everybody. And so you get, if you have 4 people on the call, but you really wanted to focus on one person, all 4 people show up and you can't really pin them in the recording the way you can with some other platforms. So it was just something that we realized after having made a decision about using the technology that we then had to kind of work around a little bit later.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's one that's better than the other right now. Everybody's working really hard to make all these options available. That's what I'm saying across a lot of different platforms. Though I will say, I listened to Bill Gates speak about something else on LinkedIn, and he was asked by the interviewee, he said, are you doing a lot of Teams calls? And he said, yes, I'm doing a lot of Teams calls with different boards that I'm on and a lot of people. And he said, and I will note to you that I have also sent a lot of feedback to the Teams team. I thought that's great. Bill Gates is even in on it and like providing some feedback to at least the Teams technology, which a lot of enterprises are running on. So I think it'll only get better. I think the important part is to know what it can do and what it can't do. And that makes a huge difference, right? In how we create things and how we can use that engagement. Zoom, which we're on right now, has great polling technology. It has a great breakout technology. I've been a part of a lot of those recently, but a lot of the other platforms also have lots of add-ins that are very interesting to play with from an engagement standpoint. The other thing we've learned about the technology aspect, and then we'll keep going, is that it is very important if you're working with subject matter experts to do some dry runs with them about what the technology does, because most of them, we've learned, don't know what the technology does either. And so again, it's like talking, virtual language, or, we're using a tool called Klaxoon. And if you're using Klaxoon and you're talking about Klaxoon, they have zero idea what you mean or what you're talking about. And so we've run lots and lots of demos with these subject matter experts to just show them what, the technology can do. And then it makes our job as building content with them a lot easier because we're speaking the same language, we have the same knowledge at that point. So we've seen not only are we enabling people in our organizations, but we're also enabling people that are trying to help us enable other people, you know, and so this stream with virtual live just keeps going. So you got to run content, you know, the practice runs for the live virtual events. We've watched as we've done iterations with clients now. The first time is okay, you know, the second time's way better. And so we've tried to take those offline, do practice runs in between to make sure everybody's comfortable with it. I would say, especially if you're running a program that has panels in it, panels are boring in conferences and they can be very tedious in a virtual live event. So make sure that whoever's facilitating that is great at kind of bringing people in and out of the dialogue, but it's not like a, oh, and what do you have to say? And what do you say? And what do you, you know, that it, because we can get in those monotonous loops, but doing practice runs has made that a lot easier for us. Video or no video, you know, so this is interesting as well. We've gotten a lot of feedback from participants about video and from the, you know, just the work that we've been doing across very large groups where we believe it's very helpful to have the people that are primarily producing or moderating, like Catherine and I are doing, on video. And what we've done internally is that when people have questions, asking them to actually come off video and ask their question, because it's great for other people to see one another. But when everybody's on video and you're like scrolling and there's different homes and you're like checking out somebody's background to see what kind of like cool thing they have back there, it's super distracting and it's not always helpful. So we've been doing the video on the main people, and then as people are asking questions and engaging, asking them to come off and engage, because it's great to see that body language that you're not getting when you're just on the sound side. And then gamification, that's something that we've been using some in some of these add-ons and apps. From a learning tool, I don't think it's more engaging for people, and I don't necessarily think they're, you know, really trying to win something, but we've had some fun with it and just made it as an activity and an engagement. In some of the tools that we've used, you see the answers of all your peers, which is kind of funny. And so you get to see what people got right or wrong. And we've had some good laughs about that. So I think using it in a way that makes sense and people are interested in, but not over rotating to it, because it doesn't have a lot of like proven science that it is over as helpful as we have previously thought. Anything else you would add there, Catherine?
I don't think so. I think, you know, this is purely the technology aspect of it. And of course, what we've seen is that the best experiences are a good merging of the content in the technology and sort of, and thinking about that. You know, we've often used like things like icebreakers or something aren't necessarily technology dependent. Like you can, you know, facilitate an icebreaker, you can, you know, ask people to do something, but it is great to see those things come together in a cohesive way.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to keep running along. So these are reminders that you know, we're constantly using, we're constantly talking about with our clients, because they can be forgotten so quickly, kind of like the first one. So a lot of material is forgotten after the first 6 days of being given it. You know, it's a lot of times it's that repetition that helps. So how are we slimming down on the content for people and providing enough ways in order to engage with the material so it can, you know, start getting stored in our longer term memory? This next one is one of my favorites. Spaced repetition can up your retention greatly. And I think with the virtual environment that we're in, we have this amazing opportunity to build in spaced repetition to alleviate some of that forgetting curve. But, you know, it's not all crammed into a couple of days. If you're doing in-person things, you have the ability to space it out over a month, or, you know, however you want to look at it, so that people can really engage with the material, experience it potentially at work, and then come back and continue to build on what it is that you're teaching and enabling to. This next data point is not a brain science fact, but it's one that I'm constantly bringing up and want to keep back of mind. And so we thought we'd share it. but 65% of content created for sales enablement specifically, this is a serious decisions number, or Forrester, it is wasted. I was talking to a group of sales enablement people last night, and it's like, so just think about it. Like, is what you're creating relevant? Like, is it needed? Is it going to be used? And let's try to not be a part of that number. That's what I tell people. Oxygen's always trying not to be a part of that number. People can only retain 7 items in short-term memory at any given point. So there's a lot of data out there. And this is also very interesting in my mind. We have like 1.5 million stimuluses coming at us every second, and our brain's filtering, doing lots and lots of filtering. And I've found, I think we've all heard of and talked about the fatigue of the video, or Zoom fatigue, depending on what platform you're on. But we have so much coming at us right now. And I think it's a great time to recognize that and to give people a little bit of grace in the fact that we have so much change going on, and how much can we expect them to take in and really retain and remember at any given moment. We forget more with just verbal, retain more with visual. Something we tried to do for the slides as we've been going through this is to give you some visual cues to hang on to when you're thinking or understanding the concepts, but we retain a lot more when there's something visual there. And I don't think anybody's going to be surprised about that, but it's amazing still how many subject matter expert decks we've gotten with just bullet points of information. It's a lot of the job that we've been doing is bringing in visual elements and cutting back and drop it down to notes, right? Put it in your notes. Something great to say, that's awesome. Do the high level and put a visual.
And
go ahead, Catherine.
Bring up one, reiterate that spaced repetition can yield 80% retention. See what I just did there?
Nice. And then the last one, only 12% are able to actually apply their training. So we just, again, keeping that back or front of mind as we're going through this, so that we're being really specific about what we're trying to get across. We're not inundating people. We're not overwhelming them, spacing things out and feeding it, doing the breadcrumbs and the repetition. And then these next 2 slides are actually something that, you'll get on the recording afterwards. And I'm not going to talk about all these different check marks, but essentially we go through with every client, and these are just examples. And we talk about principles for the design first and foremost up front, because again, just like talking about virtual or talking about something, a technology that somebody doesn't know about, inherently we have lots and lots of assumptions of what good looks like. And so we like to write them down. And it's amazing how much clarity it drives for everybody that's involved in the process, not only the full team that's designing, because they have guidelines in which to adhere to, but the client and the expectations of what it is that they're going to be getting. So we go through and we write down, you hear a lot of like, we want world-class this and we want world-class that. And I'm always like, what's world-class to you? What does success mean to you, right? And so really diving into those questions and documenting it and having conversations with your stakeholders and making sure you're on the same page makes a huge difference. And then the last one I'll just point out is the struggle and figure it out is way better than telling and forgetting. And so, giving somebody something that is difficult to wrestle with is a great thing. And not Catherine, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah. Well, one, I wanted to comment that it might seem uncomfortable to watch somebody struggle, right? Or to design something in which they have to struggle. But it is a lot better in terms of retention. And there have been a few people on the chat who asked, how do you increase that 12% statistic? And somebody else asked about rules of thumb in terms of timing and taking breaks and things. So I think a lot of those things have been kind of put in these bullets, but maybe people are asking, like, how do you take a break online, for example?
Yeah, so that is such a great question. And we worked with one client that has, we're doing these boot camps with them. They have, and it's 8. So we took a 2-day, what was previously a 2-day boot camp, and we've spread it out over 2 weeks, but 8 days. So we do 7 days. So we do 4 days in the first week, 3 days in the second week, in order to space some of it out and give them time to do other things. But they have a formula in the Excel document that every time you change the timing, it flows through the entire day. It's an amazing thing. And when we were first going in and doing the work, and we did the first event, the like mindfulness breaks, which were 5 minutes, kept just getting overrun constantly. And there was fatigue, and there were comments about it from the people that were in the audience. And so we said, we have to adhere to breaks. And we instilled music, which is something we talked about right at the beginning of this. So we brought in music, and we brought in a timer that we would put on the slides, and we built it into the agenda, and it was like a hard and fast with the production team that we don't take away the break. If anything, we might run a couple minutes long at the end, but we're going to try really hard to adhere to that. And on the second round of it, we got 0 comments about, I didn't have enough time for this, or I didn't have enough time for that. You know, just to take literally a mindfulness moment and leave and go and do whatever it is that you need to do. So being extremely intentional about it, I think, is what we've learned works, bringing music into it, and letting people, you know, just being comfortable with that.
I think that also on this slide, there's some people who are interested in knowing, like, and there was a question earlier too, when you had mentioned gamification, that examples of engagement, you know, if you're going to have slides and you're going to present content, what's a good example? Is, you know, would it be a poll like what we did? Would it be something else?
Yeah, we've done some like flash quizzes on content, which have been fun. We've done polls, absolutely. We've also done, so this isn't a Klaxoon advertisement, but something that Klaxoon does is that you can create a little end of day activity where you literally are on a journey, and you can go through and answer different questions and then see what other people answered. So anything, whiteboarding, we've used the whiteboarding tool a lot to, especially for customer demos. So a lot of this is sales audiences. And so we'll get some of the subject matter experts on there that they're doing like envisioning sessions or whiteboarding sessions with clients. And so instead of running through lots of slides, they literally whiteboard out the conversation that these people are going to have with the client. So they're watching somebody do the job that they have to go do. People have loved that from an engagement standpoint. They stop, ask questions. We did kill the Q&A one day because there was so much stuff in it. Mm-hmm. So you got to test your technology. We learned that on the first run through, that like putting Giphies and like copy and pasting pictures and things like that into the chat slowed, like made it really drag. And so we had to stop doing some of that and share it in a different modality.
Yeah, but there are lots of different tools. Like PowerPoint is not the only answer. And yes, you know, this webinar, we've got PowerPoint slides in front of you, but like, I think the point here is there's other things that you can use. You can, you know, zoom away from a PowerPoint and go into, you know, there's another tool that we use called Miro board, which is like a big sticky board that you can move around. There's no limit to the size of the board. So you can just maneuver around and put whatever stuff you want in there. For really good, I think, visual engagement.
Yeah, it's an amazing brainstorming tool, and getting ideas out from the audience, where they can even put them in the chat, and then you can put them up on the board as well. Yeah, there's a lot of different things out there. We just have to, a part of it is looking at the content and going, okay, this is boring, now what, right? And I think we all know when it's boring. And so pushing yourself to say, what do we do now that we know that it's not that great? I'm going to keep going for sake of time. These are great questions though. So tips for visual design, again, very important to talk about. How are we going to visually design something, and what are the expectations of what this looks like? This gets into fidelity. It gets into all of your branding side of things. on one of the things that we did, they decided to have an island theme. It kind of broke the whole brand template, broke everything, but it worked and people had fun with it. We also had subject matter experts showing up in island gear. You know, everybody really kind of got into it because there's not a lot else to do these days. So we had a lot of fun with some of these different themes to talk about the content and to have that engagement and just the human aspects. The other thing that we did is we broke up the presentations with introductions of people where they'd have a slide up about themselves. They got 60 seconds. This was in an onboarding to do a virtual introduction. Because it was spaced out over so much time, we were able to do quite a few of those. And it was really nice to have that connection with somebody that you don't otherwise get in the virtual environment. So that networking aspect goes away. Catherine, do you want to talk about this slide? I know it's one of your favorite areas.
I mean, visual design is like always fascinated me as well. And like how you make those decisions between what to put in front of somebody and then what to say over it and then what to provide later maybe for reference, right? Because those are all really different ways to process information. And I think that idea of like fitting it all on one slide is not a triumph. We've seen so many instances where people are like, hooray, we got it on one slide, and like you can barely read all the text. Those are, you know, even in a live environment, those are not the greatest way for somebody to take in information. So we really do like to err on the side of put something visual and interesting and nice to look at in front of people when you're, you know, and then provide a couple of little visual aids or, you know, icons or things like that, but talk about it as well. Talk about what's there and try to be as emotive as possible when you're asking people to look at something for a while.
Yeah, right. So we're diving into the mapping your virtual experience, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide and then very quickly get to the next one because I think that's a lot of the meat of the content that people are interested in. You know, very, very high level when you're mapping a virtual experience, think about what's going to happen before it, what needs to happen during it, and then what's happening post, right? So the amazing part of virtual experiences is that they can be ongoing, they can go for quite some time. You're not roped into a specific amount of seat time or, you know, in-person time. A lot of the work that we'll do is around the knowledge, information, methodologies, things that are boring to listen to somebody talk about at length when you're in person. You know, what are all those things that if I know in advance, I can come with a rudimentary knowledge of it and I'm not having to review that. And then and make those interesting, short, concise, to the point. That's what you need to know. You know, there's no need to draw it out. A process is a process. Information is information, right? So, and then in the virtual event, obviously that engagement, the application of something, the sharing of knowledge and that discussion that you can have, activities, polls, all the things that we've talked about, letting people figure it out. Breakout sessions are great for that. You know, now that we've done and had this amount of knowledge, we're actually going to go do these pitches together, and you're going to have, you know, we've run them with a lot of experts that are in the room giving immediate feedback, you know, all sorts of things that you can do in those smaller, more intimate breakout sessions. And then post is that consistent kind of drip of information and knowledge about what's next. You know, how can I keep building on this? What else is out there? And getting that information to people. So when we at Oxygen develop content, we basically follow this process. This is our process. And I think that this is interesting to me from a lot of different standpoints. I feel like we've been given very little time to shift, right? From these in-person things, from even our academic friends to corporate worlds, everybody, there's this like false sense that you can just move it. And that in my mind is just a lift and shift, which doesn't actually work. So what do we have to do in order to make it a valuable experience for somebody so you don't become that 65% of content that just gets ignored or shoved to the side, or you don't get students leaving because they just can't handle the overload anymore. And so we start by talking about the outcome. somebody's going to go through this thing. What does success look like for their role? What are they doing? What do they know? How are they applying it post going through this experience? Without that, it's very hard to do anything else or to know what's in and what's out, how much time it's going to take. You can't figure anything else out. Then you're just taking a guess and you're just adding more noise into the system, in my mind. But once you do have that outcome defined and you understand it and it's socialized and people buy into it, which is an amazing thing to do, because you can then always reference back to, well, remember, this was the one thing that we decided. Then you can start talking about, okay, so if that's our outcome, what does somebody need to know and do to be able to reach that goal, right? And hit that success measure. And then you can do the brain dump of content, which is where in our process too, we use Miro board for that in a virtual environment. We've done that both with people in a room and people virtually to be able to really collaborate and brainstorm together. You can give them access so they can write on the board themselves, and then you can have somebody just kind of organizing and following that, but really brain dumping all the content that's needed. After we get all that content out, we look at the themes, organize it by themes, group things together, and then think about the logical flow of the information. So what's the build going to be? And I will tell you, one of the toughest things that we've run into with the virtual environment is if you're using subject matter experts on different calls, they're not always available when you need them, and their schedules change and shift. And so trying to not be always reliant on those people helps to make this work and make the flow for the person consuming the information that much easier, to get to that success or that outcome that you're driving for. So group those together, flow them. We typically do this in a lot of different mediums. Excel can sometimes work, PowerPoint can sometimes work, it just depends. But we try to document it so you can see the whole map of this experience that somebody's going to go through, start to finish. Then and only then do we look at it and go, how much time do we think this is going to take? And over the, from a virtual perspective, over the course of how many weeks? And then we start to talk about the timing of each different aspect or theme of content, and in which modality comes very quickly. So what kind of modality makes the most sense for that kind of content? And then you go back to thinking about all the different things that you have, in your toolkit that you can do, from reading something, watching a YouTube video, to creating a video to watch online, to creating a virtual event, to creating pods that get together as cohorts in between these things. There's lots and lots of different ways to take it and map that experience out. And once you've done all those steps, you end up with what we call an experience map. So here's the thing we've been charged with, here's the outcome we're going to hit, and here's how we're going to do it. Then you can get into the actual creation and design of stuff, right? So then you can go into designing those different aspects. But at that point, you have so much that is well defined. We do a really fast, agile sprint on creating those materials. And it's very doable when you do all the upfront work. And then that experience map also helps you service something through time. So you can go back to it, change it, edit, and get something out, because we all know that old content is not consumed content. Catherine, you look like you had something you wanted to say.
No, I think, this might look like a lot of different steps. And I think, but when you kind of cast it against the cost of a bad virtual experience, it's actually worth it, in the same way that, we're all, our companies are all making investments in people learning to be successful at their job, especially now. Like, it's even more critical. And so just taking a look at some of these different aspects here that Juliana went through, these are like the ingredients. And even though sometimes it does seem like a lot, and wouldn't it be easier if we could put a big PowerPoint in front of people? I think we also know that that's just that people aren't going to retain it, brain science facts. So going through these steps are really part of that essential process.
Yeah, I think the hardest part too is stakeholders almost sometimes expect this to just be done like magic. There's actually work that has to go into it. And so the more we can educate and break it down, yep, that's great. This is the process. These are the steps we're going to go through to get you what you want. The easier it is to set some realistic timeframes and expectations on when it can be ready and when it can get out. And we've done a lot of this quite quickly, but if you skip a step, you almost always find yourself going back. And anytime that's happened on the team, we're like, what'd we miss? You know, and we've almost always missed one of these things, and it causes rework, and rework sucks. Nobody wants to do it. So I'm gonna, we have a discussion slide, or, you know, Catherine, if there's any questions or anything else that's popped up since we started, we can take them now.
There is a question here that actually came in a little bit earlier when we were doing the poll, which was about what type of, you know, people in different audiences have the hardest time doing well in virtual learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. Everybody's different, and it's part of why I like mapping out experiences, is because you typically hit on an area from a retention standpoint that somebody can really engage with. So whether it's somebody that needs to read through a document and really consume that and think about it offline, whether it's somebody that needs to talk through something, right? So in the virtual live, you can have that more extroverted experience. The self-paced is good for people that want to pause, reflect, think about it. You know, watching videos is great for that. And I believe that this is where the world's shifting to. I think there's a lot of things that we can take away now that we don't have to go back to, you know, kind of how we were doing it pre-pandemic. And I think that people with all these different styles are going to benefit from it, because you're going to be hitting them with some similar information in different ways or different modality types. And one of them is going to work, you know, for people to engage with and to bring in and retain that information.
So another question that we got was actually a little more kind of tactical on, like, what's a good number of presenters? So you and I are here on camera, so, you know, there's 2 presenters here, but is there like a limit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think 4 is way too much but it depends on the defined roles. So I think the important part is having clarity of what each person's role is and what they do and how they interact. So we have worked through that as well with some clients, because the first time it was like, oh my gosh, they're talking over people, or like, you know, or we never knew which person was going to do the Q&A versus which person was going to, you know, keep the dialogue moving. And so I think the key part is making sure everybody knows what their role is when they're on. And typically in the virtual live events, we will have at least one person who's kind of the master facilitator and one person who's the producer. And then sometimes we'll have somebody who's a co-lead with that facilitator potentially. But typically those are the 2 roles that are the most critical to making sure that it goes smoothly. And I can't say enough about that producer role. And then somebody that's like the tech, you know, for the problems, because they happen. And a lot of times that can be your producer, depending on the lift that's happening. But the producer will activate the polls, activate the engagement, activate, you know, that side of things, so that the facilitator can focus on the content and getting the message across and answering the questions.
Yeah, that's great. We had a question asking about, where can I learn more about experience mapping?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have no idea. We do a lot of it. I'd be happy to share more if somebody's interested. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's
Catherine,
interesting.
do you
So what I would say, and I actually I thought that was a great question on the chat. It's actually hard to find that level of detail that we just went through, because the only place that we've seen really, really good detailed experience mapping happen is in customer experience, like with consumers.
Yeah.
When people are thinking, okay, that person's going to use this Starbucks app to go pick up their order. What are all the scenarios that they're going to run through? But that's even a little bit different than what we're talking about here. We're really thinking about, you know,
how does somebody learn something new?
Yes, right. And how to
versus how do they go through an experience that's, it is, although I will say, like, we used that consumer lens a lot when we were first working through this, because we had to have a frame of reference for something. And I think in part, some of our dialogue with our customers was like, well, Starbucks didn't just create the app and expect people to show up and not have a process in place, right? And it's the same. We can't expect people to just show up and get a lot of information and be fine, and they can just go on, right? So we have to map that experience of how somebody learns as well. And, I think the people that are on the academic side would say, but of course, right? I don't think a lot of professors just show up and grab something and start lecturing, or hopefully they don't. It's very thoughtful on that side of what's the build, what am I trying to get across, what are the tests going to look like that I'm giving, have they gotten the knowledge, and what are all these different ways in which I'm going to have my students engage with the materials. So I think looking at those types of professions and things is a helpful place to start.
Yep, and we're seeing a lot of stuff on the chat, like +1 on learning more about mapping. Maybe it's a great future webinar topic to do.
Yeah.
And great. Well, we have time for one more question. The question that I'm seeing here is about the way HR is moving toward tech. Does it look like the chief HR officer should be extremely tech savvy, if not a true techie?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that we all have to have some knowledge about the technology in general. I think that from an HR perspective, I hope we drop the word HR at some point soon. I mean, I think we've been after that for many years now, and it still hasn't gone away. They're in charge of people, and they're in charge of that element of the success of a business, which is the biggest element that we have, right? And so educating our workforce is extremely important, and an aspect of that is technology. And I think it would be very difficult for me to even run my own business without knowing some of the details of how the technology works and how it doesn't work, because I can very quickly, and Catherine will attest this to you, go, can't we do that faster?
Right.
And understanding the details is where you can understand what's possible and not, and set expectations for an entire organization. So I think if somebody doesn't know much about tech, that's going to be, I would think, something that's going to hold them back, especially moving forward.
All the more reason to have a pretty good technical, architect or somebody who just knows the landscape. That's kind of more, I think, what you're talking about is having landscape.
I think it's somebody I would hire on my team, right? As somebody that's in charge of all of that technical landscape in my organization, because it is such a prominent piece, because we also spend a lot of money on it, and because we also end up with way more platforms than we probably need in front of our audiences, which is just confusing for people, and they don't know where to go to get the stuff they need to be successful at work. And as an individual contributor, that's extremely frustrating. And then you end up going outside your organization, which is not necessarily what you want people to be doing. You want them to stay, within what you're creating. Otherwise, again, you're 65% of that content, it's totally wasted. So it's absolutely a part of an HR organization that needs time and attention and care. So we're not wasting money.
Yep.
So many reasons.
So I think that we have covered all of our questions,
Awesome.
And ready for a wrap up here. And I wanted to thank everybody for being here. We had a great discussion over chat and lots of engagement there. So we appreciate you being here. This webinar is actually part of a series, and we're going to be hosting these throughout the year. So please join us on our next one, which is going to be on August 12th. And I am going to put the registration link right here in the chat. So feel free to register, and we will also send out this recording as soon as we have it available to you.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
And have a great afternoon or evening.